Hi again, everyone. Welcome to another video here from Mad About Madeira. Two videos in a row, 2 days in a row, I should say. Before I even get started, this heat that is going on here in the Northern Hemisphere is just unprecedented, in terms of it being wide-ranging. I've spoken to people from Madeira, Portugal. I've spoken to people from Georgia, from San Diego, from the U.S. Virgin Islands where I'm from. Spoken to people in Guyana where my wife is from. Spoken to people in England, people in New York City. And everyone just happens to notice that it is significantly and noticeably much hotter than what they're accustomed to. As a matter of fact, someone just posted that down in the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas, again, where I am from, I like to mention that, they mentioned that generally by now we would have had a rainy season and probably 5 episodes of heavy rains between April and now. And so far, that has not happened. Things are drying up. It's just brutal. The other day I stepped out of my house at 9 o'clock at night. The sun is not up. And when I stepped outside, it felt like I walked into an oven. That is how hot it's been. So there's something going on. I know there's some people that don't believe or figure that climate change is a thing. But, wow, it's just been brutal. Anyway, let me get to the video today. And I did make a mention of it in the video I did yesterday that I wanted to get back to updating or talking about my connection to the island of Madeira. And when I first did my first video on this channel, there were some things that I may have said that may have not been quite factual. I was just working on the information I had, or not accurate. Let's just put it that way. Not exactly accurate because I did not have the updated information. So I'm doing this here like how science does it, As you get more information, you update. So where do I start? Let me see if so come on, listen in, okay? Hopefully I can make this as interesting as possible to you. I know not everyone is into genealogy and family and so forth. So, but I'm going to try to see if I can make this as interesting as possible. So now, how do I end up with a connection to a place like Madeira? Being born in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is roughly 3,800 miles away from the island of Madeira, and being raised on another island, St. Kitts, where my father was born, and my mother from right next door on the island of Nevis. So how in the world do I end up having a connection to a place like Madeira? And also, my wife, who is from the country of Guyana in South America, even further away, how does she end up having a connection to this island known as Madeira? Well, here goes, okay? Back in 1834, the British ended slavery in their empire. Well, of course, their primary area of their empire that had slavery, as we know it, was in the Caribbean. So what they did, they brought slavery to an end and said, that's the end of this. We're out of this business of slavery, the institution of. So when they ended slavery, their rich planters who made fortunes from the labor or the free labor that was provided to them by enslaved Africans, they got upset. And they went to the British government, and these people had money, and they could be very influential in Parliament in England. And they go and they say, listen, the government decided, you guys decided to end slavery. You just basically hurt what we do, which is to plant stuff, make lots of money, and use the free labor from enslaved Africans. And you guys just basically ended our workforce. You need to fix this. Well, the British government, under pressure from these rich and influential planters, looked around like, what can we do? So what England did, they turned to an old friend, Portugal. being that Portugal and England have had this long-running peace treaty amongst themselves from back in the 1500s, I believe. And they turned to England turned to Portugal and said, listen, we need some workers to replace the enslaved Africans who walked off the plantations when we ended slavery. And we know that you have a couple of islands out in the Atlantic Ocean, and that they're going through some very difficult times. And at that time, Madeira was going through some very, very difficult times. Just a lot of misfortune hit the island over time. One, their wine industry, which was what they depended on, or which was like their biggest crop, failed. There was a blight that hit it, a plant disease that hit it twice. Then they had some religious tensions going on. And then prior to that, you had Napoleon invading the mainland in 1803, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, the mainland would have been their biggest trading partner. So with Napoleon's army being over there, invading Iberia, the peninsula, now you kind of cut off trade. And of course, the British were using Madeira as a base to go after Napoleon. So now you had some problems there. And it was just like a domino effect. And Madeira just went into just economic ruin. The Azores, no better. So when England showed up in 1834 looking for a replacement labor force, Portugal, well, at least Madeira, had a large labor force over there. No jobs. The wine industry has crashed. Nothing is going on. A lot of illiteracy. A lot of people are scattered about with nothing to do. So when England came down, they said, look, we will offer these people contracts, and they can go to our I shouldn't say former, but they can go to our colonies in the Caribbean: Trinidad, Guyana, St. Kitts, Nevis, Antigua, St. Vincent, Dominica. These are our British colonies where we ended slavery, and we need to replace that labor force. Portugal, of course, looking around and saying, wow, yeah, these islands out there, great to have them, but they're stressing our system right now. A lot of poor people over there, a lot of people hurting economically. Things are not going well. So if you can take them off our hands, great. So the Portuguese now sent, I forgot what their names were, I think they were called asientos, but they sent them out into countrysides and were like encouraging these people, hey, look, take up this offer by the British. Take up this offer by the British and go to these far-flung islands that you've probably never heard of, and just go. What do you have to lose? You're here in Madeira right now and nothing is happening for you. Things are just depressed right now. But they have work over here in Trinidad. They have work over here in British Guyana. They have work over here in St. Kitts and Nevis. Why don't you go there? So, sure, there was a lot of balking and a lot of hesitancy. But after a while, as things begin to just get so much more difficult, a lot of Madeirans were like, you know what? Yeah, I think I'm going to take up this offer and I'm going to go. I'm going to go to these islands, and what do I have to lose? I go there, I can then send back money, or I can return because the contracts were for 7 years. I can then return, probably have become rich, made money, and I can come back and help out my family. So a lot of them took up this offer. Well, in that throng of Madeirans, especially in the 1860s, a whole bunch of them just came to the Caribbean islands. And in that number was my great-great-grandmother on my father's side. Also in that number was my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. And I understand there were a few other people in there from my family, which I'll get to in a minute. Also in that number, like around the year 1901, was my wife's great-great-grandfather on her maternal grandmother's side. We later found out that also on her mother's paternal side, that his grandfather also came from the island of Madeira. And that explains how we end up with this connection to the island of Madeira. Now, the crazy thing about it, it's one of those kind of things where it's known, but it's not so much well known. Now, when I bring up the subject amongst people from the Caribbean, amongst Guyanese people, amongst people from St. Kitts or Nevis, it's almost like it's in the recollection, and people be like, oh yes, that's right. But it's not like blatantly out there. It's not something that's like taught in schools. But yet the Madeirans did have a place, did have influence in places like St. Kitts and Nevis. For example, on the island of St. Kitts is a town known as Cayon, C-A-Y-O-N. I was raised not too far from there in a town known as Molyneux, French name. And there was another town called Phillips's right above that. Well, in speaking to some older people who were old enough to kind of remember some things from back in those days, they would say to me, yeah, come to think of it, there were a lot of white people in Cayon when I was growing up, and they used to call them Portuguese, or Portuguese for Portuguese. And they would say, yeah, the name Madeira used to be tossed around, like, yeah, they came from Madeira. It was like almost like a given. Oh yeah, they came from Madeira. Yeah, Madeira, Madeira, Madeira. Now in my time, I never used to hear much about that. But these people who are in their 70s and 80s, they will tell you things like, oh yeah, I grew up, yeah, there was a bunch of Madeirans living in the area and a bunch of white people from Portugal. That's what they would say. And I don't think they knew what brought these people there. I don't think they put two and two together per se. But looking back in hindsight and looking at the history, now it makes a lot of sense, at least to them when I speak to them. And of course, now it makes a lot of sense to me. As I said before, I did not know any of this. So how did I even come around to finding out anything about this? It started with this. My grandmother who raised me on the island of St. Kitts, my father's mother, there was something about her that was different from most of the people in the community. Of course, as a little boy, I did not quite notice it, but as I got older and I came to the United States and I found out and the whole thing about colorism and all this color thing that goes on over here, I realized that my grandmother was actually white. But as a little boy growing up, I didn't really pay much attention to that. All I know, she was a grandmother. So when she died in 2007, on my birthday, July 6th, which was just last week, as a matter of fact, a week ago. So when she died, you know, miss my grandmother. She took care of me as a little boy growing up. And then it dawned on me that I just did not know much about her. So I go fishing around trying to find some information about her, like, okay, mama, you know, I know her as mama, like, but yeah, who was her mother? Who was her father? What was it all about, you know? And by the time she passed away, I was not living around her, and I did not know the questions to ask, the proper questions, because I wasn't curious at the time, you know? And you don't know how much I regret not being able to pick her brain when she was still here with me. So I go asking around, and eventually I stumbled into a first cousin of my father. And this first cousin would have been a nephew of my grandmother who passed away. Now, he didn't really know my grandmother personally because they grew up apart from her, or they did not grow up with her or around her. But he knew enough from his mother, who was my grandmother's sister. He knew enough to tell me what I need to know just to start this curiosity and this path of me coming full circle to actually visiting the island of Madeira. What he did, he said, he was writing to me in an email, and this was back in 2008 or 2009. It's when he first wrote to me. And he said to me, he goes and he says, my mother's grandmother, that would be my grandmother's grandmother also. He said, my mother's grandmother came from Madeira. And he just continued on, came from Madeira and whatever. But again, it's like they would just say it like it's just like, this is something I should know. Like she came from Madeira. Like I wouldn't stop and like, Madeira, what does that have to do with us 3,800 miles away? So when he mentioned Madeira, the first thing that crossed my mind, I knew it was Portugal. And I'm going to tell you the reason why I knew. But when he said Madeira, I just thought that Madeira was a province, a place on mainland Portugal. I was not aware. As much as I am a geography freak, and I happen to know just about where every place on earth is, for some odd reason I had never heard of a place known as Madeira. I heard about the Canary Islands, I heard about the Azores, but for some reason Madeira was not a place I heard of or heard about before, which was really odd. So it was one of those things where it was like, wow, this is fascinating. I did not really know this. So, but I didn't jump at it. And one of the reasons why Portugal was Portugal was a place I knew about. Well, of course, I knew of Portugal. I knew its history. I studied about it in school. I know where it was on a map and so forth. But in terms of Portugal entering my family line, an uncle of mine, my same grandmother who passed away, her son, my father's brother, he had said something in passing when I was much younger. And he said to me, Mama, that's my grandmother, his mother, he said, you know, Mama's people come from Portugal, right? And when he said that, it never resonated. It was like, Portugal, okay, you know, never put two and two together, never thought it through, never thought much about it or whatever. So when this cousin now in 2009 mentioned Madeira to me, I'm thinking, okay, his grandmother, I mean not his grandmother, but his great-grandmother, my grandmother's grandmother, and his mother's grandmother came from Madeira. So I said, okay, she came from somewhere in Portugal. As a person who's very curious, for some reason I did not jump on the information and look it up to see where Madeira was and what it was all about. Just let it slide for a while. Okay, so that's just there. So now it was over on my mother's side now. One day I was talking to my mother, I want to say a couple years later, just talking to my mother, and I guess I'm getting older, more curious about where my family comes from. So I go and I speak to my mother and I said, Mom, I don't know much about your father, because my mother did not grow up with her father, so of course we didn't know much about him. But I went to her and said, Mom, I don't know much about your father at all. I mean, what about him? My mother went ahead and she basically told me she did not know much about him either, because he grew up apart from her. She did not grow up with him and so forth. But she said to me, I have some first cousins that you can speak to who knew him better than I did. So I go to those first cousins and I started asking questions. So as we're talking, I remember my grandfather, because I met him twice in my life. Once when I was about 11, and another time when I was much older. And I'm going to tell you something about him in a minute. So I do remember one thing about him. He had this long wavy hair, just wavy hair, and I'll get to that in a minute. But he had this long wavy hair from what I did remember. So when I asked my mother and she directed me to her first cousins, they said to me, oh yes, your grandfather, yes, this was him, this was blah blah blah. And that was about all that they told me. But that same grandfather, in 1999 or 2000, I went to Nevis. That's where my mother was born. I go over to the island of Nevis and I meet my grandfather. So this is the second time in my life and the last time in my life that I ever met him. First time when I was 11, and now I'm in I forget how old I was back then. But you know, I'm older. So I meet him, and when I saw him, remember, I had no perspective about him. I had no context. It's just a man standing in front of me. Knew nothing about any background with him. Didn't know anything about his family. Knew nothing at all. But when I was standing in front of him and I explained to him who I was and told him I'm his grandchild, I remember he was older and his hair was white, and I touched it. I was like, wow, where did you get this hair from, you know? And he said something to me. He says, my grandfather was a white man from Barbados. When he said it, I was just like, okay, you know, figured, older guy, probably just saying some things off the top of his head. Made no sense to me, no context. Here we are. I know my mother was born in Nevis. I know her father, the man I'm talking to right now, was born in Nevis. I don't know where Barbados comes into the picture. But then, as the years go by, when I start to ask these first cousins of my mother about my grandfather, it started to make sense. They told me that his grandfather came from Madeira, came from Portugal. And it looks like when he left Portugal, he came down on a British ship. And back in those days, the British ships used to leave Europe and travel to Barbados, and then from Barbados they would move on to the other smaller British colonies in the Caribbean, smaller islands like Antigua, Montserrat, St. Kitts, Nevis, and so on. They will also travel down to British Guyana, known as Demerara back then, and then from there they will move on to other parts of the Caribbean that were under the British flag. So it looks like my great-great-grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather, left from Madeira, came on a British ship to Barbados, don't know how long he stayed there, and somehow made his way over to the island of Nevis. So when my grandfather said that to me, oh, my grandfather's a white man from Barbados, what he was actually telling me is that his grandfather, from what he can remember or what he knows, is that he came from Barbados. He didn't go back as far as saying he came from Portugal. He just said he came from Barbados because maybe that's as much of the information as he had at the time. He just knew his grandfather came from the island of Barbados and settled in Nevis. Later on, that was further expanded when I spoke to other family members to say that yes, that man who went to Barbados actually originated on the island of Madeira, and that's how he ended up coming to the island of Nevis. So now on both sides of my family, there's Madeira on my father's side, there's Madeira on my mother's side. Like, okay, interesting. Again, I never really jumped out and pursued much about it at the time, but it was just interesting to me. It just became more interestinger, if I can use that word. So now, enter my wife. So my wife and I got married in 2015, but I started talking to her in 2014. In 2014, before we got married, I went to Guyana. I think my second trip to Guyana, I go down and my wife introduces me to her grandmother, her mother's mother. So I go and I'm speaking to her grandmother, who is like me, loves to talk about family. So we're just sitting there talking, and she's telling me all about her mother, blah, blah, blah. And she gets over to her father, and she said something to me. We were talking, just talking. I did not mention anything to her about my family history. We were just talking about different things. I'm listening to her telling me this one is related to this one, that, whatever. And then she says, my father was a white man, and his father came from Madeira. And she said it to me nonchalantly, not like, oh, let me tell you where he's from, let me get a map and show you where he came from. She just said it to me as if like I should know where Madeira was. But when she mentioned Madeira, I said, wait, your grandfather came from Madeira? She says, yes, came from Madeira. And she would never say Portugal. They would say Madeira as if it was a different place, but she just happened to mention Madeira. And I said, wait, Madeira. So your grandfather came from Madeira. So my wife that I'm married to right now, her great-great-grandfather came from this island. Yes. And it was at that point when I said, you know what? I need to really check this place out. I need to figure some more out about this place. Well, Madeira, why is it? I'm sorry. I have on the AC today because yesterday you guys had me burning up in the car without the AC. But anyway, once I heard about this, I started researching, started looking more into it, and started finding more out about this beautiful island. So I started looking up information. I eventually found out it was an island. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Looked at a few pictures. Was like, wow, this place is really, really beautiful. So my wife and I are there. We're talking about it. And then around the same time, I did mine before hers. I think I did it like 2 years before. I decided to do a DNA test. So let me go see how much of this oral history is actually true. So I go and I do the DNA test. It comes back. And when I look, of course, there were some things that were not surprising to me, Africa being to the top and so forth. But as I'm looking, I look down and I see Portugal at 11% or 12%, somewhere around there. I was like, oh, I was just like, that's interesting. And I was just like, wow, this is fascinating. So what they were actually telling me was actually true. I said, wow, that's fascinating. So I started encouraging my wife. She took a while, but she goes ahead and she does hers. Now mine just said Portugal. Now it has changed. And funny enough, now I have more Spanish DNA, or it shows more Spanish DNA than I have Portuguese. But that I will explain a little bit later if I get the time, right? So then my wife does her DNA test. And when she does her test comes back not with just Portugal, but specifically Madeira. And the interesting thing about, at the time, what I did not know about on my side of the family, my wife at least had something to go with, because her grandmother remembered her grandfather and remembered his name. And his name was Jose Teixeira Doraya. And the interesting thing about it, if you go and you look that name up in the Portuguese records, you will see that in 1901, a Jose Teixeira Doraya left Faial, if I'm pronouncing correctly, in Madeira, and we've confirmed that's where the family came from Faial, and he traveled to Demerara, which is, we call Guyana today. That's my wife's great grandfather. So she had something that she could work with. She had a name that she could work with. So all of this is what led us to the point where we started saying, you know what, I think we want to go to that island. Well, I wanted to go, and I just encouraged my wife. I said, babe, listen, for our anniversary, instead of going to Cancun or some romantic destination, why don't we go to this island? We don't know anybody there, don't know anything about the place, and we didn't have any records on hand to go ahead and say, see, here's proof. Because keep in mind, what basically happened with our families had a lot to do with just the times that they were. My grandmother, who raised me, the one who was the granddaughter of a woman from Madeira, I'm sorry, apparently she did not grow up knowing this grandmother. I don't know how much she knew, because she never conveyed anything to me, and I didn't have any curiosity at that time to know what was going on, to even ask any questions about her grandmother while she was alive. And the reason why I say this, it's because my grandmother and her father looked like they did not really have a relationship. So her father would have been the son of this woman from Madeira. So I didn't have any questions to ask her, but being that she did not have a relationship with her father, I am just figuring that she did not have much of a relationship with her grandmother. So no legacy was passed down to me or to us or to her children, my father and his siblings, about anything to do with Portugal. So that's why it was not something that was passed down, that was readily available to me when I came along. On my mother's side, a little bit similar. My mother not growing up with her father, so no legacy, no oral history was passed down from my mother to us about her great-grandfather. So didn't know much there. My wife's side, I wouldn't say there was no legacy passed down, but it was a situation where when her grandmother was born, it's one of those situations where her father was Portuguese, and I guess he had my wife's grandmother with a local woman, and all the scandals with that, local woman, she's black, and all that stuff that went on back then. And I guess he more or less did not associate himself with his daughter. I'm not saying that was his desire. I really don't know what happened, but I guess the times back then, it was like he stayed in his corner, and she stayed in her corner, and then my wife's grandmother did not really grow up around her father, even though I'm getting news that yes, he did have a record store in Guyana, and she used to go and visit, and other family members used to come by. But again, this information was not necessarily passed down, or I guess the children, my wife and all, were not interested in all that information, at least, or they didn't show that they had interest, so their grandmother did not say anything to them. But when I showed up, she told me she gave me all the tea. She gave me all the information about her father being a son of a Portuguese man. Never asked about the mother, though. I need to ask about that. So it was rather interesting in terms of how things were back then. So this is what basically brought us all the way around full circle to wanting to visit a place like Madeira, and how we ended up going over there, and my wife eventually finding family over there. Me, on the other hand, I did not find family because I didn't have all the information I needed. But when I came back home here to the United States, I was eventually able to track down a few people who are actually family of mine. One of them lives in New Jersey, and one lives in Madeira, as a matter of fact, right now, as I'm leaving this video here with you guys. So that brings us around to how we have a connection to the place. I gave you a little bit of a history as how the Madeirans actually made it. Of course, Madeirans have gone to Hawaii, have gone to other parts in the United States, to Australia, to South America, to various places. The Madeirans have been a traveling group of Portuguese people, but they also did come to the Caribbean. And when they came to the Caribbean, I am a part of that legacy of these Madeirans who came through. So now you could see why the place means so much to us. We've gotten a chance to go, and it was really amazing and beautiful to me, because I tend to be a rather sentimental person. And it was not lost in me that when I touched down, when my wife and I touched down and we walked off onto the airport tarmac, you know, I'm sitting there thinking to myself, wow, somewhere around here our families walked past, probably rode carriages to Funchal to get on those boats, probably walked, you know, these areas right here our ancestors actually inhabited. And it was just in my mind, like, they never went back to Madeira. As far as I know, none of them ever went back to Madeira, because, you know, you're talking about after a journey for a few months across the Atlantic Ocean, you know, you're not in any rush to jump back in a boat. Most of these people over 7 years began to assimilate in the local culture that they were a part of, and they never came back. And I just felt as though when my wife and I went back, it was like we were taking them back to where they came from, something they never had an opportunity to do. And here are their legacies, my wife and I, and we're going back to Madeira and touching down, and it's like we're bringing them back. I mean, we weren't physically bringing back their bones, but it was like in spirit. It was like we were bringing them back to where they came from, bringing them back home. And that's the title of a book that I actually want to write about all of this, bringing them back home. Oh, we brought them back home. And so when I think about the island, it now means so much more to me. An island I had not known anything about, all of a sudden has become a symbol for me, you know, has become a place that, just like I feel about parts of Africa, but the difference is, in Africa, I don't even know where to start, and that's a whole other story. But at least with Madeira, I have some tangible information to work with. And it was so beautiful when, to confirm this oral history, when I go into the archives on the island of St. Kitts, and I look up and I see my great-great-grandmother's name on birth records. You know, I see my grandfather, my grandmother's father. I see his birth record, and I see his mother, Maria de Jesus, from Portugal. I see her name there because I was told that's what her name was before I even saw the record. And I look and I see her name is Maria de Jesus. And then I go over to Nevis and I look at the records there, and I see my grandfather's, well, his father, who was a child of this man from Madeira. And I go and I look and I see some of my great-grandfather's children, siblings, younger siblings. And I look at their names and I see the name, and at the bottom I see James da Costa, my great-great-grandfather who came from Madeira. So over here on my father's side, I see Maria de Jesus. Over here, I see James da Costa. His first name may have been different. You know, probably went with the James part, being in a British place. I really don't know. But I look over, I see da Costa here. I see de Jesus over here. Or Jesus. Or Jesus. I think that's how the Portuguese pronounce it. Then I see my wife, Teixeira Doraya. Now, the other interesting thing is this. Turns out that the other day I was speaking to one of my older cousins. If you're talking about my mother's siblings, her oldest nephew. So it would be my mother's oldest sister's oldest child. So he's old enough to remember some things that we younger ones don't really know. So one day, I hadn't spoken to him in years, probably about almost 3 decades we haven't spoken. So I spoke to him the other day, and we were just talking, and we weren't talking about anything to do with Portugal, weren't talking about anything to do with Madeira. He was just telling me he remembers me when I was a little boy. Of course, he knows who I am, remembers me as a little boy, because him and my mom are very close, you know. That's my mother's nephew, you know. So even though they're close in age, but it's my mother's nephew. That goes to show you how much older my mother's older sister was. And we're talking. And as we're talking, he starts going back over, and I said something to him about mama, and mama being my mother's mother, my grandmother on my mother's side. Of course, I also call my grandmother on my father's side mama, okay? But now I'm talking about my mother's mother. So while I'm talking to him, he goes on and he was like, oh yes, I grew up with mama. I was mama's favorite little grandchild, because he was the oldest. And I was just like, okay. And he's going on, and he says, yes, and mama's. I said, I don't know too much about mama's mother, because I heard she died at a rather young age. And from the way the story has been told to me, back in those days, without flashlights and without the necessary facilities for hospitals and so forth, a needle broke off in her foot. And I guess it traveled up her bloodstream and eventually, I guess, reached her heart and, ended her life. Okay? So that's my grandmother's mother. So he's telling me, oh yes, I remember Nana. Or he's saying his mother remembers her grandmother, Nana. And then he's continuing, and he said, yeah, Nana's mother was a white woman from Portugal. I'm using my accent. It says, yeah, Nana's mother was a white woman from Portugal, and blah, blah, blah. And he's going on talking. And I said, can we back up a bit? What you did say there a minute ago? I said, you said Nana. That's my grandmother's grandmother. I said, you said what? He said, yeah, she was a white woman. She come from Portugal. And when he said Portugal, I knew it had to be Madeira, So I said, let me stop you there for a minute. And when he told it to me as a matter of fact. It wasn't like, oh, by the way, let me tell you about this special place known as Madeira, and you probably didn't know this. He just happened to just say it like in passing, like it was no big deal. Like I'm supposed to know this. And I'm like, you said Portugal, right? I said, yes. So now I've got my father's great-grandmother, my mother's great-grandfather, and another person, my mother's great-grandmother on her mother's side. So her great-grandfather on her father's side, her great-grandmother on her mother's side. All Madeirans. And over my father's side, Madeira. So why wouldn't I feel a certain way and a certain connection to this island 3,800 miles away from here? And that explains why Madeira means so much to me to this very day. An island I had not known about for most of my life, but it was always there hovering over me like a shadow. It was always lurking around me, and I did not even know. Way back when, my uncle said to me, when I was much younger, and my uncle said to me, Mama's people come from Portugal, right? And it made no sense to me back then. Come full circle around right now and look at where we are. So there's more details to all of this where I could have gone in and be more detailed, but of course this is already 40 minutes into this video, and hopefully I've kept your attention up to this point. But this has really been a fascinating journey for me, and the journey's not going to end until I go to live on that island. Until I go to live there. Of course, I have St. Thomas where I'm from. I have St. Kitts where I was raised, where my, those are islands. I could always go there. They're much closer. But I tend to look at Madeira as a mature St. Kitts, a mature and grown-up Nevis, a mature, established St. Thomas. And I'm saying that because you go to our islands, they're still going through certain struggles with certain things. This is not to say Madeira doesn't have its issues, but things like electricity, still a big issue. Reliable internet, it's good. It's pretty good, but still have to deal with that. Then, of course, you have to deal with the hurricanes and everything that goes on with those type of things, and some other things there that I just don't really care for. Love my island, will always love it, will always be a part of my heart, and I could always live there. But for right now, my wife and I feel Madeira, in terms of the infrastructure, the safety, the healthcare system, all of those things matter to us at this point. My wife and I, we realize we're getting older. And here in the United States, it's really true. We're afraid to go to the doctor sometimes because you know what the bill is going to look like. We're talking about going for a checkup, and it's like, oh, how much is it going to cost? We're already worrying about that type of stuff. Oh, I need to go to the dentist, but it's going to cost this amount. We're worried about things like that. We get to a place like Madeira, that may not be that big of a concern. And we have a 5-year-old that we have to worry about. Schooling over here will put us in bankruptcy just for him getting to college, unless he gets a scholarship fully all the way through. The student loans that are killing people over here, probably wouldn't have to worry about that in a place like Portugal or in Madeira. So that brings me here to the end of this video right now. I'm sure there are things I've forgotten and missed and overlooked and whatever. But I hope that you've gotten the gist, and I hope I've updated you with some of the information here that I didn't from my first video. And I hope this is a little bit more clearer. And I'm sure there's going to be more information I'm going to find out, because there's a lot more information I'm still looking for, and there's a lot more information that I've gathered since then. All right? Anyway, thank you so much for spending 40 minutes here with me, your whole lunch break most likely or longer. So I really appreciate it, okay? So you guys take care until the next video. I really, 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 really appreciate it. Like, you can subscribe, you can share it. Hey, if any of you in here are from Madeira and you happen to know the person who is in charge of tourism, or you happen to know who is in charge of immigration or whatever, you can always go ahead and show them this video, okay? Hi guys, you can show them this video, okay? I would really appreciate it. You guys take care. Thank you for tuning in. Until the next video. Bye from Mad About Madeira.